The Wanderer grinned defiantly in the face of his exhaustion. He had actually managed to drag himself into the side of the village. He had wrapped his left arm around his stomach and held it as if he were wounded, but in fact only wanted to suppress the growl. There was another passage to the east, but time was money and one did not want to let neither of the two spill over and be lost. Strictly speaking, one could also take the path of the Crystal River Pines. However, that was a bit like jumping out of a spire to save the stairs, so without roads and trails, this path was treacherous to say the least. One did have the mountain range the just elevation for orientation and only needed to move along it, but the many rivers from the mountains that eventually converged to from the Lake of Equilibrium made crossing it a thoroughly life-threatening challenge, especially in winter. Nevertheless, he would have preferred to take this path, because what was considered safe for the others here was at least problematic to him. With the still injured horse, however, he had not been able to take this detour. Besides, the cold would have increased so close between the mountains and the water. Certainly, he suspected he would have died there. But maybe they would make up for that here. From here, however, could see no one of the consecrated blade. The good thing about the soldiers was that they always made themselves look so good that one could see their enormous shine from afar. Still, he had pulled his hood deeper into his face when he reached the village. It had a church of Thorin, and in his experience churches awakened something in people that seemed to want to do him no good, and yet he walked straight towards it, although people were gathering there. From what he overheard, the reason was a story. But more importantly, as far as he knew, there was always free bread with this story. Something very distant in his mind itched for attention, for perhaps it was ultimately nothing more than bait luring him into the end. But somehow the thought had something heartwarming for him, because the bread would be his in any case, and his worst enemy right now was hunger. After he actually got hold of one and the person handing him the loaf had given him his blessing, he stood a little apart in the outer rows. Even though it really wasn't easy this time, he had practiced restraint. To attack the bread like a wild beast would have attracted attention. So he broke off piece by piece and stuffed it into his mouth. Moreover, if he was already here, he might as well listen to the story, although he suspected he already knew it from his childhood. Dear children! A man in a blue robe with a white stole embroidered with the symbol of the consecrated blade in gold on the left and right began to speak. In addition to this, he wore on his chest the symbol of a healer of the consecrated blade. A brown staff with white angel wings, some of the feathers of which were golden. We give you this gift, as Thorin gave us life and liberty. And, while you are under no obligation to listen to these words, we ask you, in the name of higher justice, to stay a while and listen. For if these words are forgotten one day, mankind may once again be thrown into a dark age, from which it emerged thanks to the power of Thorin. He cleared his throat, apologized, drank a sip of water, and then began the story. According to legend, even someone like the god Thorin was born. A regular human being like you and me. This is said to have happened on the 21st March of the year 8001 of a time called the Age of Resurrection. A time which, seen from today, dates back thousands of years. Little has been handed down to us and little is known about it. But we do know that a new age was ushered in when Thorin, a human, succeeded in snatching our kind from the clutches of the dragons who ruled at that time. But you, as good children of Thorin and good people of Sanctor, will not listen to such lies. For every spirit of yours shall be strong and steadfast against the billows which come to you from the mouths of such false prophets. The Wanderer sighed. Gradually his throat began to dry from the bread, but it was even harder to choke down the blather. Thorin attained divine status when he bathed in the blood of that dragon who let himself be called the All-Mother. By expelling life from her body, he had breathed life into us. Before that, the dragon had formed us however it pleased it. He tapped his thumb against his chest. We had to perish, and then poked his index finger high up. As soon as the dragon got tired with us. Already came the first shouts that Thorin had freed them and how great this was. Thorin, my children, ushered in the age of the gods' fall. It was the time when the gods who played with man would lose power over us. The time when we won our freedom by the blood of our enemies. More cheers. The Wanderer could already feel his head getting thick with this nonsense. To him, actually pretty much anyone who boasted of having won anything with someone else's blood was, in short, an imbecile. On the other hand, he didn't want to judge those who might have saved him from starvation. That was when the bread began to taste sour to him. Shortly afterwards, his pride kicked in, but he choked that down too, because it had never filled his stomach. Right now the man was busy telling something about how people used to wander in the darkness. Before Thorin, we had no light to which we could be guided. But today we can finally say, I see the light. Whereupon everyone repeated the last words. The Wanderer shook his head.
Can't one also be blinded by the light?
He asked himself in thought. But when someone asked whether Thorin had not been killed by an elf, he saw where such thoughts led one here. Yes, the man might not have been lynched now, but possibly later. In any case, the looks of the others spoke of unified, concentrated disgust. The way their attention was suddenly fixed on this man made the Wanderer feel that it was probably time to get back on the track. This was worse than the tickle of a blade point on the back of his neck. In his opinion, people were only good to each other as long as they had a common enemy. Yesterday it was the dragons, today the dwarfs in the south. But as soon as this civilization even began to crumble, he was sure they would quickly degenerate into savages, and one could then watch them go for each other's throats in the blink of an eye. Minutes later he found himself in a local tavern. He had sat down in a cozy corner not too far away from the big fireplace. It was in the middle of the room, something he had never seen in other taverns. One could watch the cooks preparing ordered food for the guests. Actually not a bad idea, the Wanderer thought to himself, because before it always seemed like he ordered something and then after a while it just came out of some back room. Who knew what was going on in there? But this time he had no money to order something to eat, so he made do with a cup of water, which one got for free here. The waitress had eyed him strangely, but at least she hadn't said anything else or introduced his butt to the kicking technique of her broad-shouldered friends. Near him, a few people were chatting about the speech of Thorin's church that had been given earlier.
What that guy had said is also something I had read once.
Now, don't you start too. Do you want your arms and legs to be broken?
To be cut in four?
Or to be cut in four, exactly.
No, of course not. All I'm saying is, if it's true that Thorin was killed by an elf, then why are we still trading with them, for crying out loud?
Well, to get their virtuosium ore. Anyone with elven education in their head knows that our king is trying to make us advance.
You didn't understand the point. Why don't we just get the stuff? After all, if it was elves we have to thank for Thorin being killed.
If he was killed.
Wait up. How do you know that's not the king's plan anyway? Maybe that's why there's war in the south with the dwarves. Nah. That's because they're blocking the only path to land that could be used for larger caravans from here to Nahilua. That may be one reason, but what if you take it a step further? After all, it is already the case that the king does not tolerate anything magical in Sanctor. What if he expands that?
Well, I don't think there are enough troops to do that. Does he want to mess with the whole world?
Do you know what I'm saying?
Spoke a brawny man who had a thick scar on his blinded right eye. It looked as if something had once torn half of his face apart with a claw.
An eye for an eye. If the whole world takes an eye for an eye.
They now suddenly heard the black-armored man speak from the corner with his cup of water.
Then it will eventually be blind.
Huh? What?
The guy now asked. The Wanderer leaned back and threw off with his hand.
Forget it.
For a while longer they looked at him silently, until one of them shook his head and they finally turned their attention back to each other, which he was glad of. He had no energy for this, always having to explain himself to people who wouldn't understand anyway. Let the whole world go blind, maybe then they would finally leave him in peace.
Don't you like our boat?
The hostess finally asked him, just as he had his hand on the door to the exit. The Wanderer looked over his shoulder at her.
Well, you see, he began, shrugging his shoulders. It's hardly different from all the others to somebody like me.
The woman narrowed her gaze.
What is that supposed to mean? For some people, one forest is like another. For me, one village is gradually becoming like another. Just like the huts and the people who are in them.
She looked at her blonde hair, and then at his black. Just as she was about to say something to that, he had already closed the door behind him. With the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, he rubbed his temples as he came to Azar, who was pilfering hay that one actually had to pay for.
Come on, big guy.
He spoke softly to the animal, patting it on the shoulder.
I guess we should move on before we attract any more attention.
He took it by the reins and began to make his way out of the village. Shouts could be heard here and there. For the most part, they were for advertising of one's own wares. Now and then, the blow of a hammer on an anvil resounded. Finally, there was the clatter of Azar's hooves. The animal was a sight to behold in places like these. Aside from the consecrated blade, there were really usually only mercenaries who could afford a horse, or people who owned land. But all that was pushed into the background for the wanderer. There was something else now than the constant worry that the soldiers of the consecrated blade might suddenly be there. He thought of Iros. It had been a while since he had left the camp of the Shadowdagger mercenaries, and suddenly the question arose in him how they were doing, especially in winter, even if this one seemed to be over soon.
Akira, Amaron, and Baron. I wonder what you are up to right now.
It went through his mind. He didn't even notice how someone was walking into his path, and it finally hit him on the shoulder too, so that he jolted out of his thoughts, and after walking a few steps past the guy, stopped and looked behind him.
What was that for?
The man asked the wanderer provocatively. The latter bowed slightly and said,
I'm sorry about that. My fault. Wasn't thought.
As he tried to walk on, the man grabbed him by the shoulder. From the grip he immediately realized that this was someone who was used to being able to intimidate people quickly.
You're not getting away from me that easily.